Thank you for having me. I'm Nancy McGovern. I'm going to be here talking to you about curation of data, preservation of data, from a digital preservation perspective, but applied to things to do with research data. And we're going to be talking about terminology and a whole bunch of cool things. I am currently the head of Curation and Preservation Services at MIT Libraries, and I've been there, it'll be 4 years in February. It's amazing. And I'm from Massachusetts, so coming to MIT means coming home. And you never know when I'm going to start dropping R's or doing fun kind of language things, especially at the end of a day. So let's get going. I'm going to be talking about community context because a lot of what we talk about in digital preservation, where the standards, the practice, the history is so essential to understanding what is good practice. More importantly, what is good enough practice? A lot of times what we're doing is kind of worrying, looking for perfect, and all the data is going away, all the digital content is going away. So what's good enough? How do we kind of do some things now? I'm going to be telling you about the Digital Content Management Initiative at MIT Libraries that I'm the lead for, and it's taken some turns recently where we have a digital sustainability lab that I want to mention to you. We're going to be looking at the research data example, so context. Within the DCM initiative at MIT, the research data piece is one that we've been really wrestling with, and with things like the open access initiatives from the federal government, the plan of what our agency is meant to do with open access. Libraries are really used to working with the journal piece of research, not with the data piece. It's reversed for me. As an archivist, I've been working with data for a long time, and I'm learning a lot about the journal side, but they're very different, so that we'll be talking about that. And then just some observations at the end. So community context. One of the things that still happens in the digital preservation community is that people who enter, I think of it as coming on the highway. They kind of just keep going forward. They don't kind of look to see who's around or what might already be on the highway. So we've been seeing additions each decade to the digital preservation community. So in the 1960s, pretty much in all, except for Africa, probably all continents of the world. And, we never count Antarctica. But National Archives and the data archives. So in the US, 1967 was when the US National Archives started its electronic records program that was primarily focused on structured data from federal agencies. And data has been in, computerized, machine-readable data has been in the Federal Records Act since like 1939 or something like that. So National Archives are on board. Switzerland, Australia, there's a whole bunch of them. Not everyone, but if they were dealing with computers, they had a program. Data archives, so in the introduction I mentioned that I was at University of Michigan just before coming to MIT. That ICPSR is the largest social science data archive in the world. How do they measure these things? But nobody's come forward to say they're not. So it's a very large data archive. They started in 1962, and by about 67, they were working in a digital mode. Before that, it was punch cards. We have this kind of boring debate ongoing about is a punch card a digital or not. Either way, it's something that works with computers. So we have these programs emerging. In the 70s, there was just a lot of concern. If you look at the archival community literature, there's a lot of articles on, we're going to have to really do something about electronic records. Just angst. And you kind of had to say it if you were going to have an article. You had to kind of say, oh my gosh, we're really worried about electronic records. We didn't have solutions, but we were thinking about it. Digitization comes in the 80s. So one of the first earliest big examples of digitization is from the Patent and Trademark Office in the US government. They have a huge need. They also had some of the most large fails because the technology was so new and so immature that they really had to struggle to get going. They were awesome and pioneers, and there are other examples like that. But so we start seeing the data before that, the data that we were working with at the National Archives, is effectively born digital. People work on computers and they save it on that point mag tapes. We were starting to see, I have a paper or analog thing and I want to use it in digital form. So digitization comes on the scene. But the library community really didn't jump on board until the late 80s, into the 90s. And there's a sense of, I have this collection of analog materials. If I make a surrogate of it, then it'll be increased use, protect the content. Still not at that point. E-journals is starting to come up, and we start seeing that as a real threat of e-journals. As soon as it's the difference between digitized, which you have a sense of a safety net, you can go back to the analog, you can go back to the paper. For born digital, you're the last resort. If that goes away, and especially if it's archival material, you're the only protector of that content. So it goes away, you're not preserving it well enough, it's gone. So there's a real, the burn of I can't fail really heats up when you have born digital. So we have libraries, museums. Similar to libraries, they got in from, I want to take pictures of my collection, my objects, and I want to use that, and I want to have metadata to do it. But they also are starting to get into digital art and other kinds of museums online, and much more, they have digital content that they are now acquiring. The web collections, by the mid-90s, everybody was starting to, they had to have a website. We start having massive national and international collaborations to do web archiving. So all of this is going on. So as people come into the community and they go, oh my gosh, look it's a new field. So we have people still coming to conferences and saying, it's brand new. We don't know what to do with digital preservation. How are we going to deal with this? And those of us who have been, on the highway for a while ago, oh look, there's a new one. At least we have to learn from what we've done before. What happens is technology is going to continue to change, and we're going to have to continue to respond to it, and that's great. So practice, people say, oh, well, practice doesn't really keep up with technology. Well, it's not going to drive technological change, but the success means we come up with a strategy, including for research data, which is a fairly new addition. We come up with a strategy in a reasonable amount of time after a generation of technology comes into play. That's success. Some of the, when we first got into digital office files and things like that, there was a real delay. And there was too much of a pause in preservation strategies, and that was a challenge. Right now, too much of what we're digitizing, for instance, if something wasn't typewritten, it started off as a digital article, and what we're doing is printing and digitizing it. So what we really need to do is embrace getting to the original that was digital and preserving that directly. We are expending a lot of wasted resources on digitizing things that we should just be managing immediately in digital form. So you want to go back, when you take things from the content curators, the people who created the content, you want to really push to see if you can get the original. If someone gives you a PDF, that's not the original. It's something they saved as PDF. And they may or may not have done a good job at saving as PDF. So we want to think about where's the content coming from, where are the places involved. So geospatial was actually something that came out at least from the 80s, until the web came on and we have things like Google Maps. The geospatial area was so specialized with software and hardware dependencies that it took really putting it into the web environment where any browser can do all the things that we want to do. So you see the drivers in each of these categories of being like, well, what makes it so that all of a sudden it becomes a real factor in the digital preservation community? Digital art, since the 50s, people have been messing around with digital art forms. It wasn't until we really had the web and people were sharing it. There's the human side of all of these areas. In the digital art realm, part of it is the ethics of, should we keep that? Should we really, if the artist doesn't want it, do we do it in spite of that? I don't think so, but that's a conversation to have. You see e-science at the end of the 2000s, and then you see research data. E-science was really about the processing gusto of big, grid computing, supercomputing. Research data is the outcome of research, and that's really what we're going to focus on. And you see analog archives here. When I started at the National Archives in the US, I always have to say the US because the US presumes that we are the world, So when you ever talking to anybody from another country, it's really good to, US National Archives, not the. But when here I am, I'm an electronic records person, and I just thought, wow, the archival world is going into, we're doing it, where it's all becoming digital. Archives is going there. In 1976 was the circular for, let's have a paperless office. We're still not there. So here we are in the 80s, I'm thinking, we're moving into the digital world. No. we still have a lot that's created in paper. We still have a lot to manage, and we probably always will, at least for a good long while. So analog archives is very different from the library world. It's, our archives are much more heterogeneous, the formats, the sizes, and things like that. So it's really possible to get up to production on, here's my articles, here's my books. You really have a broader range in archives, among other things. You have different kinds of rights. You may be not able to make some things available for 30 or 50 years, so big difference. Believe me, I'm not going to spend so much time on all of the slides, but it's really important to know that we're not just starting like last year or even a decade ago. There's a long history of doing things. This is the seminal report for digital preservation. When I first started working on it in the 1960s too, when those programs initially started, we weren't calling it digital preservation, but we were preserving digital content. So this report, Preserving Digital Information, the group there is now called CLEAR, and it's a still very active group. They publish a lot of reports. They fund a lot of these kind of community activities. This was the first time, this 1996 report was the first time that archives, libraries, and to some extent museums, and internationally came together to study the problem of what are we going to do about managing digital content for the long term. So we start seeing things that we see now, which is we're worried about obsolescence. Obsolescence is not a problem if you're managing the content well. It only becomes a problem if you're not paying attention, if something falls out of active use. If you put it onto a storage media and put it away, that's not actively managed. So obsolescence doesn't have to be a problem if there's good management. The report also raises things like legal issues and all the kinds of things that we talk about now for digital preservation. So if you haven't ever seen the report, you should go back. It talks about any of the content that we have to manage. What is it that organizations are going to have to do to make the content available over time? It calls out that in the digital world, because people feel like they can't see it, they can't pick up the box of records and look at it, that there's a need to do self-assessment and audit to kind of demonstrate good practice so that it's not just a, trust me, I'm doing a good job. It's a show me I'm doing a good job. It's a good report to look at. This is a whole bunch of digital preservation standards and practice. Trusted Digital Repositories is a document, de facto community standard that came out in 2002. It talks about what does an organization have to do to demonstrate good practice, and specifically in implementing the second one, Open Archival Information System, OIS reference model. So that's a crucial standard, and that just in the last month, the next revision of the OIS reference model has started. And it's happening in a kind of more social media kind of way. It's an open discussion, and people are able to put in their suggestions for what should happen to OIS. And there's a lot, I think that we'll see more. In the last revision, we saw some things that were specific to archives. I think that we'll see some things that are specific to data. So I think it's worth watching. The producer archive standard it builds on the OIS, and it basically says whatever kind of content, including research data, any kind of digital content, whatever kind of content the producer creates, there has to be a handshake between the producer and the archive. So it allows for record scheduling, appraisal, acquisitions in libraries, acquisitions in museums, whatever we call it, it's that handshake between. It's not a standard that people really focus on well enough. If I ask people, do you know PAMIS? They more often than not say no. It's an important standard, though, and it's one worth looking at and understanding how you can manage the relationship between the producer and the archive. There's things like the NISO, the U.S. National Body for Standards. They have had since about 2000 the Building Good Digital Collections. It's a set of principles about how should collections be managed and metadata be handled and projects be dealt with. And so there are a set of principles that are a great frame for somebody's digital preservation program. Premise, we have to have information about digital content, so preservation, metadata, implementation strategies. The first version was in 2005, and version 3 came out within the last month or so. And we're still seeing what are the implications of the new version. It's a significant update, but there's a continuity from the very first version in 2005. It's what is the preservation metadata that we have to have for our digital content to be able to make sure that we can make things available now and for future users. We have to think about the cost, so the Blue Ribbon Task Force on Sustainable Preservation and Access. Turns out we called it BRTF, and National Science Foundation has many BRTFs, but this is our BRTF. So it's a cost model that came up with some core things like, what is the value of the content? What is the role of the people around the content to help preserve it? It shouldn't be just me or somebody like me trying to do it alone. So the people who create it, use it, want it, fund it, all of those have a role in this. And what are the incentives to preserve? In the past, we sort of looked at it as a public good and sort of, we'll be over here working hard and preserving things. And we really need to look at it as a community activity. Like if people create content, they have some responsibility for ensuring that it is stored well and can be made available in the future. The people who really want the content should really do things to encourage its good management. So it's not just sort of like, you go off in a dark corner and do whatever preservation people do, and we'll just we'll just want you to do that. We won't help you, but we want you to do that. So it was a really important report. People thought that they were going to say some kind of a formula, like here's what the cost of preservation is. And they actually did something much more important, which is how do we understand the cost factors for preservation? Because once you know what you have to do for preservation and you figure out through things like the OAS reference model how we have to do it, then you really naturally get to how much. And finally, I mentioned in the 96 report that TRAC, the Trustworthy Repositories Audit and Certification, is a direct outgrowth of that. We need to have some way of measuring good practice, demonstrating it in accordance with a set of standards. This is the yardstick for digital preservation. So this is a diagram model that we use from the Digital Preservation Management Workshop. It's been running since 2003. We're about to do our 50th workshop in March. Very excited. So it has very core principles. Basically, it's about good management of any kind, but it's applied to digital preservation. And the thing that it does is similar to looking at the standards we were just looking at, the organizational leg of the three-legged stool. The three-legged stool is a very common concept. It's a balanced approach to anything. It's how do I develop an approach that is, in this case, sustainable. So this is about developing a digital preservation program. The organizational leg is what is my program like as opposed to yours or yours or yours. It's what kind of content do I have? What kind of organization do I have? What kind of resources do I have available to me? So what are we trying to do? What's in scope? And as importantly, what's not in scope for my program? Therefore, we can look at how. One of the things we know for as long as we've been doing digital preservation is that people are very, very, very inclined to focus overly on the technology piece and not on the human piece, not on the making decisions, that really hard parts. People don't really want to make those decisions. Am I keeping this or I'm keeping that or both? For how long? Who gets to have access to it? There's a lot of questions that need to be addressed. There's no way to throw enough technology at the digital preservation problem statement to make it go away, which is what people kind of hope. But there should be a partnership between the what are we trying to do, therefore, what kind of technologies do I need to use it to do that thing? So the technology creates the content we have to manage. It also creates the solutions for managing it. So as the developments come along, we need to be monitoring it, not only so we have an understanding of what to anticipate coming down the road, but also to improve our own practices, our workflows, and therefore we can figure out how much it will cost. So that's the formula for an organization to figure out. What does my program look like? What kind of technical environment do I need to do that? Therefore, how much does it cost? People wanted to jump to the how and the how much. And if they don't figure out the what, there's no way to get beyond it. So we talk about trusted digital repositories. These are the characteristics of a trusted digital repository. OAS compliance is presumed. In fact, in the first drafts of TDR, it wasn't even mentioned. It was developed so that organizations, well, if we're going to have this OAS standard that was slowly developing since the mid-90s, what is that going to mean for organizations? How do we deal with that? So OAS compliance is the thing that the Trusted Digital Repositories is addressing. How does an organization demonstrate compliance with OAS? After that, administrative responsibility is an explicit commitment by an organization to do digital preservation. It's about making it explicit is important because it's a high-level commitment. It usually takes the form of like a mission statement on a website. But if you don't have that, it's almost impossible to come up with a sustainable program. You're fighting against this tide. Organizational viability, as for any program, means you have the people and the place and the things and the equipment and the funding, the wherewithal to do it. So organizational viability is you have the legal status, you have all the things you need to do a digital preservation program. Financial sustainability, so in 2002 when the document came out, it was the first time that the cost was separated out in this way. So organizations have to come up with a compelling case for here's how we're affording our program. Here's how we put together our resources, we partner in this way, we invest in this way. You don't have to show anybody a budget statement, but you do have to be able to say, I'm committed my resources in this way this year, and I intend to continue to do it. So you have designated funding. It's not the first thing in the list. They really are in some kind of priority order, but it's really essential. So technology and procedural suitability, it's what technology do I need? Everybody doesn't need the same kind. If you're only doing digital image collections, you don't need the same kind of technology as somebody else who's doing geospatial and web archiving and the whole full range of digital content. Procedural suitability is the thing that allows you to say, I can show you that I'm doing good practice. You don't only make a decision, you document it so that you can demonstrate that you're applying that decision. And then system security is as soon as, whether all of your content is available and it's public from the beginning, you still need to know who has access to the content, and you need to be assured that someone can't just walk in and somehow take your servers and take, that it's protected. It's incredibly important for confidential information. So when you get into confidential data, when you get into raw data that then gets transformed into public versions, you really have to think about the system security piece. It has to be appropriate to the content that you're managing. And then procedural accountability is the cumulative way that you show I can demonstrate good practice. It's for internally, so you develop your program. It's also externally. This is your sort of window to the world. If your stakeholders, anybody that you partner with, if you have to demonstrate good practice, people outside of your organization have to be able to see that you're doing a good job. That package is the attributes of a trusted digital repository. That's what we're aspiring to do. This is the Open Archival Information System model. Okay, it's the one that's just coming up for revision. It's been in active use even before the final version came out in 2002, the first standard ISO standard version of it. It was informing what we were doing. So if we look at this, this model is kind of brilliant in that it's a reference model comes out of the computer science community. And it's meant to define a problem statement so that you can develop solutions to solve it. So what OAS does for digital preservation is that it defines the problem statement so that it can be deconstructed and then reconstructed individually for organizations to do whatever they need to for their digital preservation programs. So it includes the roles. You can see producer, management, consumer. Producers are entitled to give you content or required to give you content, so researchers on a project. Consumers are entitled or required, they're interested in getting your content. They have to follow some rules. So data seal of approval is an example of some principles where consumers are actually expected to demonstrate good behavior if they use data. Management is the bottom line. It says it approves the budget and it approves the policy for, like we have this high-level policy that kind of encapsulates the trusted digital repositories and says, this is what I'm doing with my program. So the management is responsible for approving that. The rest of the box is all about the archive's role. It's all about who's doing it, what are they doing. So the inside of the light blue box is actually the archive's role. It's not explicitly called out, but it's the whole focus of the OAS model. So we have the who. We have the what. So you see SIP, APE, and DIP. Submission package is what do we get from the researchers or from the people who have the content. One of the things we learned at ICPSR, which is the Social Science Data Archive, is that we generally don't get a well-formed submission package. We get kind of stuff. We get sort of, here's a file and here's some metadata. So we actually call it the proto-SIP, of what we get from the submitter, and we transform it into a submission package that we then can commit to preserving. But we have a submission package. Ingest is it's a controlled intake. It's accessioning. It's whatever an organization calls it. I have this content. I took it in, and this is what I think I need to go through. Quality assurance. I need to take these steps to make sure I have formats I can preserve, metadata appropriate to keeping it for the long term. More information than if you're only going to keep it a year or two. Where did it come from? What's significant about it? Technical metadata and so forth. So the ingest process transforms it into something. When you get to the first ape there, that's the archival information package. That's what you're saying. I'm willing to say to the world, I'm going to preserve this content. That's the first version of it. So when you look down a little, you see the second version of the ape. That's the archival package coming out the first time and every time thereafter, 50 years from now, to be transformed into a dissemination package. The purpose of a preservation program is to be able to not only provide current access, but long-term access. And if the packages are constructed well, they're able to serve that purpose. So preservation partners with access, which is sort of beyond the consumer over there, to be able to take this content from the past, bring it into the present, and make it available for the future. A lot of times the access program, people start saying things like, there's too much metadata. That's an access perspective. A preservation perspective knows that the objects have to accumulate as much information as they need to be able to be preserved well. You deal with, for access, it's current technology, and we'll look at this, but, and for preservation, it's reliable technology. So underlying all of the functions we're seeing there is the appropriate technology, your technology environment to manage, to preserve the content that you have. So we have ingest, take it in. This is basically input, process, output, the classic information system model. It's how do we take it in? What do I know about it? So process is both information about data management and archival storage. I put it in the vault so I have it for later. And then access is bringing it back out again. In addition, we have preservation planning, which is what we're talking about tonight. It's how do I get ready so my content is prepared to go into the future. And administration is all of this decision making. What kind of system are we going to use? What kind of content are we going to take? If you look at the OAS model, there's everything kind of is tucked away in there. What policies do you need? What decisions are required? And the single biggest thing that happens in OAS is messages that go so that when you get your submission package, you send back to the producer, I received it. Messaging is the single biggest thing that happens in OAS as a function. So this is what it looks like. We get the content, and people are, both the people who create the content and use the content and manage the content, especially if they're from an access perspective. They're really focusing on the content. I have this file, I got this file. You need to know about the file. What do I need to render it on my computer? What kind of information, what kind of software was it created in? What kind of software do I need to use it? This side over there comes directly from the 96 report. It's their integrity feature. So what has to be true? What do I have to preserve about the content to be sure that I can preserve it into the future? So fixity information means I got this thing and I can demonstrate through fixity checking. So you run a checksum, a numeric fingerprint for your file, and you're able to use that. You run it periodically, and if it's the same, it hasn't changed. If there's any change, there's a difference, and you have to figure out why. So you can say, however long after you've gotten something, that file is still the file that you got. It's unchanged. That's important for preservation. Reference information means I can say it's this object and not the billions of other objects in the world, so that someone can cite it, someone can find it, use it, discover it. Context information is how does this object fit into the rest of the world? How does it relate to other things with it, other things in our collections, other things in other people's collections? Like linked data projects that we're seeing and things, that's all about the context information. And the provenance information is, what do I need to know about this thing? What happened before I got it? What happened since I got it? It's technical information, organizational information, all the things that you need to understand that object. The 2012 version of OAS added access rights information because it's not just about copyright and intellectual property. It's about preservation rights. It's about, do I understand the access issues and preservation issues well enough to be able to ensure that I can make it available in the future? So that's what an OAS package looks like.
Sorry, can you say that last piece again? The access right information?
Access rights information is really just, it stores metadata about their rights. Do you have I took this in and the producers transferred the preservation rights to me and said, yes, you can make as many copies as you need to. It also has any of the other, is it a confidential, all that information. So that's what it's intended to capture. If you do that at the beginning of the life cycle, when you get it, you're able to then make it available. And a lot of times, people don't really think about some of the preservation rights and the other rights until the moment they want to make it available, and usually it's too late. The people that are, might have been able to help you are gone. In a research environment, there are often so many people involved in producing research data. It's really challenging to get the rights. There could be dozens or hundreds of people involved in a project. So who actually has been designated the right to deposit, the right to convey the rights to an archive, to making it available? This just is from a diagram from the OAS, which demonstrates that. So we were just looking at the archival information package diagram. The OAS knows that an object is part of one or more aggregations, a series of records, a project, any kind of collection, so an aggregation of some kind. So the model allows for all of the membership of the object as part of this aggregation. How does the packaging work? It allows for all of the information management that goes along with the content that you have to bring in and take care of over time. The reason that they focus on that is that when you look at the high-level OAS diagram, it could look like we only deal with individual objects, when in fact there's more than 100 references to the collection kind of level. And that's really important because people are looking for, how does this thing relate to the whole thing? In libraries, this is a book in a series. In archives, this is a record in a series that's part of a larger record group. So the context is essential. If you pluck things out of their original context, they may not be at all useful to the people who need it further down the road. So if you can't prove that this thing, this digital object I have, is actually from the office of the president, that you can demonstrate it is that letter. If you just kind of have it and go, oh yeah, I think this is it, you have to be able to demonstrate the chain of custody. And so those packaging rules are the things that allow you to document the context so that you can say, these are the research results from that project that we were just talking about. Here's the experiment plan, and here's the data from it. So this is getting at the fact that from the technology lake's perspective, the computer really just deals with if-then statements. So you can imagine someone sends you data. You say, if it comes from this office, I can take it. If it comes from one of these offices, I don't take it. These if-then rules. That's where the administration side of OAS comes in. You make a lot of decisions and say, what's the scope? And if you define your rules, you can automate it. So when you get a certain kind of file format and you say, we're not taking that file format. So you could say, if it's this kind of format, take it. If it's some other kind of format, then raise a flag. Tell the human that they have to do something. So the technology leg is looking at this kind of, when they say policy, they mean very specific statements that are controlling very specific parts of preservation. At the highest level, the preservation planning piece of it has to have a broader narrative document that captures the intent of the organization and says, this is the scope of my program, these are my objectives. It's a real document that you can click on and read. In between, you have lower level kind of decisions and policies. So I have a preservation storage policy that says I'm going to have so many copies for like 3 copies of video, more copies of text files located in multiple locations. It's going to give you kind of a roadmap of what does my preservation storage look like. Okay. These individual decision statements are the halfway house between the organizational piece and the technological. So the computer needs to have coded information that allows it to just be automated. This is literally the narrative deconstruction of if I get a video, make 3 copies. Okay, it's really important because when we talk about procedural accountability in the trusted digital repositories, this is what we're talking about. And this documentation itself has to be preserved. It's a record of what you've done. It's the context around the content that you are preserving. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the stuff that's more specific to the data piece of data curation. When the Digital Curation Center in the UK was established, they kind of had to coin the phrase, and it was emerging as a term, and they had to come up with a definition. And this was the original definition. It's a bit different now, but this is the one that I like. Digital preservation plus data curation equals digital curation. It's important to know the parts of it because digital preservation is about all the activities we need to do to keep the content usable, meaningful over time. Data curation is value-added activities. It changes, it improves, it enhances the content so that it's as meaningful, as useful to a community as it can be. The combination is digital curation. So when people kind of conflate digital curation or any of the other terms, it's usually data curation that goes away because it's not pulled out as a very important set of activities. And data curation predates the digital world. Chemical abstracts, a lot of kind of data, the community cares about it, and so the data curation is about, this is like it's a census data kind of thing. This is information we care about. We want to make sure that it's curated in a way that ensures we're investing in that process so that the community has it long term. But thinking about the use of terms is something that's important. We don't have a central source of this is the authoritative global place where terms for digital curation and digital preservation come out. So we have to kind of define the terms, working definitions of these terms so that we can talk to each other. So we can figure out, when I say digital preservation, I mean X. Because people mean all different things about it. So digital preservation, this is the Library of Congress NDIP program, has been active since the early 2000s. Their definition is pretty actively used. So active management of digital content over time. It's about quality creation, so you can't end well if you don't start well. So providing guidance for how do I curate my content, how do I convey it over to you, all of that guidance piece of it. So digital preservation is ongoing activities to ensure that the digital content is available now and into the future. Preservation is essentially long-term access. It's about the purpose, you don't keep it just to keep it, you keep it to be able to make it available. So when we think about this long-term access, we have a preservation column and an access column. Very often, as I've said, people want to conflate preservation and access. They want to put them together. They want the system to do all these things. With our current state of technology, we don't have to do that, but we need to make sure that the handshake is there. So from a preservation perspective, as I said, you want to look at proven technologies. You don't want to take a chance on your preservation technology. You want to make sure that it's reliable. In terms of metadata, you want it to accumulate. Anytime you do anything over time, when you have to, you want to document that you've transformed the file format. You want to document even that you've changed your storage management environment. So all of that gets accumulated and documented. Your preservation objects can get as big as they, conceptually as big as they need to do preservation well. But if you were to hand that preservation object to a user, they would say, this is gigantic, and it's way more information than I need. So the whole part of a dissemination package is to distill it down into a lighter weight access format and the minimal amount of metadata that you need at that moment in time to understand and use the content. So on the access side, that is where you get into cutting edge technologies. You don't have to worry about it. You only need that access object for as long as it survives in that current state of technology. Somebody wants it on their phone now, great. Who knows what they'll want in 10 years. So access can respond to the push of technology to the cutting edge if preservation is doing its job. So the metadata is like, what do I need right now? So a lot of times the access column the access people want to kind of, just in case, add in metadata about preservation. If the preservation can trust that access is happening well, and access can trust that preservation is happening well, they can both be tuned to do things as they should do, and they're not burdening them. So you can't tune a preservation system to do real-time access. And you really can't add enough information into a real-time access system to make it also do preservation. You need to focus on, it's modular, you need to make sure that they're both able to play to their strengths. Preservation is about slowly and steadily moving across time. Access is about get it available right now. So when we think about secondary use of data, when we think about reuse of data, that's what's involved. So data can either be defined very narrowly as this is data from this particular scientific process. But when we talk about digital curation and data curation, we really mean it's just a stand-in for referring to any kind of digital content. It's your data that you're managing. So it's important also to think about, do I really mean research data, or do I mean my data as in all the total set of information that I'm responsible for preserving? And it's not that you have to spend a lot of time worrying or fussing with the terminology, so long as you say, when I say data in this context, I mean X. And making it explicit, so just writing it down. Here's my working definitions. A really good thing for organizations to do is to create a glossary. Here's how we mean this. This is how it's used in the broader community. So research data, the ANS is an Australian National Data Service. They're doing some really great stuff. But they're talking about data, records, files, other evidence. So it doesn't have to be digital. When we talk about, that's the thing about data curation, we talk about research data, it doesn't have to be digital. Many of the science domains, the research domains that we're working with have used paper lab notebooks until very recently. The researchers themselves haven't been necessarily working in digital form for decades and decades. So we need to be aware of that. We also need to be aware that this whole open access data and journals kind of discussion that's been going on, it's a change in the way that research is done. It used to be that the journal article at the end was the end product that we were focused on, and we didn't really have to care as much about the rest of the life cycle that produced that final data product. And that's, we need to be thinking about the fact that we have that you have to do the whole of the context for how did the data come to be. We have so a researcher says, here's my research plan, you keep that. You have the stages of the project, you have raw data, you have it processed into final data. You need to have the evidence of how this thing came to be, and you also need to have the article that says why it's important. So, we need to have effectively a record schedule for research data. In this context, this is what we have. We don't keep all the data in the world. So how do we know what's significant? How do we make decisions about it? The thing that records management does for us is allow us to be consistent and comprehensive and compliant. So we say, these are our rules. When it's this kind of data, we keep it. When it's this kind of data, we don't. We don't have that yet for most of our research data. So we have research data, and what does that mean? It's the outcome, it's the results from a research process. So curation can refer to, and like digital curation, data curation, preservation and maintenance of the assets themselves. It can also be specific things that a curator does, like in a museum context, and so forth. It actually comes out of a religious context of a curate. Was responsible for the kind of the religious life of its community. Interesting to think about in terms of curation. So data curation, active and ongoing management of data, it really though gets into this value added. So at ICPSR, we had about 120 people when I was there. 60 of them were doing data processing. We have topical archives that were managing the results of federal agencies, so Bureau of Justice Statistics, the economic data, educational data, all of this. So there was the expectation that ICPSR would take the data and transform it into documentation that was consistent, complete, and so you have the documentation, you have the data, and people can use it. That's data curation. So from an archivist perspective, so at the National Archives, at the other end of this, we were taking the data and saying, this is the record, this is what was produced, and you document every single change to it. So a really different perspective on it. Both things have to be in play. We have to have, this is the data as produced, this is the data as it's made available. Digital curation is the things cumulatively, active management, and it's the totality of the actions that we take, including data curation, including digital preservation. Lifecycle management is a kind of parallel thing. Lifecycle management is the thinking from the time that you know that you're going to have digital content all the way through to it being made available to current and future users. In the middle, you have the preservation piece of what are the steps that we need to do. So it's connecting these dots. It has to think about how do we demonstrate conformance. We're aligning with practice. In terms of computer science standards, various kinds of domain standards, digital preservation standards. There's a lot of documentation. A lot of it happens once. At the repository level, you say, we're adhering to the premise standard for preservation metadata. You don't have to say it each and every time. All right. So that's the background. When people say that they're doing digital preservation, when they say that they're doing digital curation, it's informed by the community of practice that's been developing for decades. It's informed by standards that are emerging. You can tell from the list of standards that we went through, they all have a track record. They're not just been developed once and then nobody took a look at them. They're being maintained, they're being actively used, they're being improved. They're responding to the ways in which our field is very applied. So it's not good enough to say, in theory, this should work. It's demonstrating that it does. So we have this good practice. So at MIT Libraries, we're trying to develop a digital preservation program. That's my responsibility. That can align, clearly and demonstrate this alignment with the standards in practice. And we're getting there. So what we're doing is, when you think about it, when we talk about collaborating across an organization to manage digital content, at the top level, the intellectual collections and acquisition strategy, this is archivists, librarians who are responsible for saying, we're gonna take and preserve this content, we're not interested in that. We don't have the responsibility for that. My job, so a lot of times people will come to me as the preservation person and say, should we preserve that content? That's not the question for me. The question for me is, if you say you want to preserve the content, I help you figure out the best way to do that. I am an archivist, I can make those decisions, but really it's the digital archives program, the library collections program that's meant to say, this is the scope of content that we're going to preserve. So there's that. Once we get to the point of this is what we want to do, the collaboration really takes place at the workflow level. And that includes the IT people, it includes preservation, it includes the content curators, it includes the people who are building the access services, so how are we going to discover and use the content? It's very much a shared responsibility across the organization, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to coordinate across, and organizations don't naturally have those paths. You have to build them. You have to build the relationships so that the people who are acquiring it know the kind of information to gather. There's these handshakes going on across the whole of the life cycle. Preservation, my specific at the workflow level, I'm collaborating with all these other components, and I'm making sure that I'm responsible for ensuring that we can demonstrate good practice. So that means making sure I can check in with everybody and help them figure out the best forms of documentation. my specific things that I'm just simply responsible for are, do we have preservation strategies? Do we have preservation formats in place? Do we have we identified media that what kind of storage plan are we going to do for preserving our specific content? Archival storage, we're kind of transforming to preservation storage because it conveys both the technological and the organization, the decision-making around how are we going to put together the pieces of our program to manage them. And then at the bottom layer, this foundation layer is the IT. Now, partnering with IT can be really challenging because they're typically looking at immediate concerns. Do the desktops work? Are the servers up and running? Is the website okay? We have to kind of really have long-standing conversations with them about this is what we need to do for preservation. So, having a system backup is not the same as doing preservation. It can be a piece of it for business continuity, but you really have to work on, well, why isn't that acceptable? All of the objects, the more that, so a system backup is very software dependent. And that's not good for preservation. It also is one big ball of wax, whereas when we talk about archival storage, we're talking about managing all the files individually and making sure that we have enough metadata for them. So they're very different kinds of perspectives, but they can partner effectively to come up with strategies. So we've already gotten at some of these life cycle roles, but there was a responsibility and a role for the people who create the content. A producer might be responsible for it even if they didn't create it. Who's got the right to give the content into an archival situation? A curator, so the overall content specific at each stage, like who's responsible for ensuring that this content is ready, so 5 years after we get it, a question comes up. If the curator has to figure out, oh, I've got to fix that problem. I need to get some more metadata, get some more documentation or whatever. Archivist, big A and little a. So archivist is about understanding the rules for ensuring access, for protecting the content, for making sure that it's available over time. Manager at any level, points of time, so that from the director of an organization all the way through operational workflows. Coordinating all these kind of pieces. Funders, both local and beyond. So at some point, someone has to approve the funding for a sustainable program. How do we do that? An advocate can be anybody, somebody who comes in and says, I really want this digital collection to be up. How can I help that to happen? Can I help with the metadata? Can I give you a bunch of money if I have that? So advocate can be anybody, and you need champions. If the program is one or two people trying to do this for the good of the world, it's great, but it's not sustainable. So an advocate, if you have a professor or a particular user who's really interested in this stuff, that's the best voice that can come forward and say, we have this research data and we really need to make it available. And then the consumer, current and future. So the users were used to kind of sitting back. Users would go to any archives. I swear, if you put an archives on the top of a mountain, it's almost like a point of pride that they could go and get there. In the digital world, we're trying to figure out what does good service look like for making content available. I have confidential data. I can make it available in a secure environment. So, but to do that, the consumers are really starting to realize that they have a role in making sure that the content is available. Okay, so we have this, we have the standards and practice in place, and we know that technology is changing. So what you have, people always say when they come to our workshop, they say, what's the one place I need to look to find out what's happening with digital preservation? There's like 25 different places at least, and they're all changing because people change and organizations change. So what you're seeing is when we look at good practice is this evolving mix of community efforts. So premise, when we started the preservation metadata effort, it was kind of overdue. We really should have defined preservation metadata a decade sooner if we could have. So when we did it, local efforts in a void, people just figure out, well, this is good enough for now. When they started to develop the first version of Premise in 2005, there was something like 34 different schemas for preservation metadata that they found. Now the community effort kind of put those together, rationalized them, and figured out, here's the recommendation we have for, this is what we should do. So good practice emerges when the community says, here's a standard, and the local people take it up And more organizations say, yep, I'm working with the standard, I'm taking it up. We have examples of standards that were great and they came out and nobody used them. That means it just they just fall to the wayside and people carry on. It takes a lot of effort for a community to do a standard. And the reason that standards are so helpful is that it allows you to get on with the more complex decision making. If you can just line up with the standards and say, this is consistency, this is practice, you can scale up. There's no way to scale up and get into a big production mode, and for some of the research, the big data things we're dealing with, we have to be able to scale up. So the standards allow us just to build tools and workflows that make that possible. So this model is going on all the time. So local efforts, there was a New Zealand standard that was really dominant at the beginning and really informed what became Primus. But if that, at the end of that community effort, if there isn't a real take-up, it's just a nice group of people getting together and coming up with something that didn't go anywhere. All right, what we're trying to do at MIT is this coordination. It sounds like such an easy thing, but organizations, the communication strategies necessary for it, really challenging. They're having to have new kinds of conversations. Different people who never had to talk before have to kind of figure out a bridge. It's really hard. That's a lot of my job in any organization I've been. Digital content reviews, looking at how do we understand the content from a preservation perspective, not from a subject perspective, not from a file format perspective, like, oh, we have video files. It's from a, what are the issues for management that I have to deal with? So I'll show you a little bit about that. And then we're doing these digital content projects. This year we've been working on ebooks, which is tied to some of the open access journals and other kind of things, but ebooks. And we've been looking at digital audio. And we've had really good results from that. So this is to give you an idea, this is for MIT. Now, somebody else, these categories would be different. For instance, we call out theses as a separate thing from scholarly record. Why? Because at MIT, there's so much funded research that 95% of the theses are the copyright of MIT. And we also have a different way of doing things. So right now, I don't know, we still have about 100,000 theses going back to 1870 that we really would like to be able to digitize. Right now, because of the issues that we deal with theses, they're mostly in paper form, and there's a lot of those kind of challenges. So another place, theses is not a problem, they wouldn't call it out, they'd have one category, we have to highlight it. So this is about an organization understanding its own content well enough to be able to make good decisions about it, to be able to manage it. So people sometimes look at the list and they go, well, why didn't you have this? This is our list. So, and a digital object is metadata, content, and packaging. How do you bring the pieces together? An object doesn't have to be stored together, but it has to be able to be correctly constructed. So if someone says, can you show me the results from that study that I'm interested in? Then you say, here's the results. You have to be able to repeat those results the same way correctly multiple times. You have to be able to demonstrate that. Whatever approach, whatever technology you use to do that, it's up to you. So a digital content review is the structured process to do lifecycle management. We have a template. It goes through, basically, so we're going to be starting web archiving pretty soon at MIT in a more systematic way. We have a little bit of it going on. We're going to do it a lot more. So what is the implication for our current workflows, our current processes, once we start doing that in terms of selecting it? Which websites are we going to go after? The intake process, are we able to do that right now? Some of the underlying factors in this are what training are we going to need? What kind of tools are we going to need? And there's the implementation of the tools, which is largely an IT function, and then there's the human use of it. And those things you have to make sure that we have the skills to develop and implement as well as use. And we often forget the use part. It's sort of like, here's the tool. And a lot of them are complicated. And so we have to have training and also give people a time to acclimate to a new way of doing things. So we have processing, storing, preserving. So it's a structured template that we use. It's available through the DPM website. We have a whole set of management tools, the workflows, all the things we've been talking about are there. And that's because every trusted data repository is expected to have a high-level policy. There's a way of showing this is how you develop it. We need to be able to have an inventory of our content. Visual content reviews help you to do that. We need to be able to have workflows. There's a process for documenting the workflows. So it's the digital content reviews is trying to get at how can I get a picture of my content that I'm responsible for right now and also that I'm anticipating. So we know that 3 years from now, we're going to have a lot of web content that we don't currently have. So how do we, it's a planning tool. It's a way, when we had a new associate director for technology start, and I showed him the landscape diagram that I'll show you, and he was like, oh my God, this makes sense to me. This is something that I can see that what's coming down the pike as well as what we have right now. Very often people only focus on the now. What do I have right now? All right. So there's these two parts. You do this picture. I love pictures. So it's a picture of the content. What are the different kind of categories in video? We have instruction video and research video, and the pieces. How do they fit together? How do they relate to each other? You do these life cycle reports and say what are the implications. So then I can take that to the director level and say, these are the implications, this is what we have to do. We're good in these areas, but we're really going to need some training in this part. We're going to have to invest in these tools. The only ones available right now are proprietary, or we have this open source thing. We have a digital sustainability lab where we try out these things so that we can push them out into production. Okay, so cumulatively, we can sort of, what's specific to the content, and then how can we prioritize the kind of content management that we want to do. So a bucket. It's not about, like I said, it's not about subject. It's not about what's our file format types, as some people want to focus. No, it's about where does what is the something that informs, that requires a divergent work path? What is it how do we have to manage things in a different way? So a bucket could be defined. It's a category of content that might be sort of like if I'm getting it from a researcher versus I'm getting it from a publisher. Those would be very different kinds of things. What happens in processing? So if it's confidential, it might require a whole different sort of workflow. There also, the kinds of things that can inform the buckets are how do people discover it and how do they use it. Anything that sort of changes what we need to do with the content once we get it in. So the landscape view takes this individual, so here's my video, here's my audio, here's my research data, here's my web content, and puts together a picture that allows you to study it. When you look at it, we're building up to seeing the diagram, but so a clear version of it means that we have it right now. We're already managing it. The more gray it is, the more we know it's coming, but it's not here yet. That means you have to scale up over the next so many years so that, 3 years from now, we're going to be in production mode for web archiving. A triangle can turn into a bucket any time, but it's something like student records on campus. They live with the registrar's office, but we have to know a lot about them because we're eventually going to be preserving them. Similarly, a lot of the research data, it has to live with its research center for a long time, and then it comes into us. So we're trying to anticipate when are things going to come. And external sources, we have, for instance, some geospatial data that is effectively streaming. So we have a music streaming service. Those are black boxes. They are services that are external to us. We're not responsible for preserving the data itself, but we are responsible for making sure that the service is preserved, that we retain access to those services. So it's a lot of monitoring, it's a lot of looking ahead and thinking. That's what the preservation planning role is about. This is what our diagram looks like right now. And each of these is a category, so audio and video. We have research data. We'll look a little closer at that. Institute records, scholarly record, visual resources, and so forth. You can, if your eye is trained toward it, a lot of times people go like, I can't read the details. It's not about that. It's the impression of, oh my God, what's that? That's web archiving. And there's this is research data. We'll take a look at that. And video, we know it's coming, and we know we have to do it soon, and it's all dark gray. Just a quick look at the research data and how we're looking at it. So this column is about possible sources for research. This is about things that the library, the archives might manage, citations, various kinds of web content, administrative records. This can be potentially fodder for researchers to do their projects. We haven't really maximized what services we're able to provide from our own data that we produce. We need to really be able to put that out into the research environment. We're looking at, from the preservation perspective, and I'm hoping that the rest of the libraries takes it up, but we look at it as nobody can, and the libraries, nobody can specialize enough to know about all the disciplines that produce research. It's just a no-win. And they're interdisciplinary and they're changing every single day. Okay, so this is looking at it from a method perspective. If two researchers in two different domains are both doing a survey, the advice we would give to them for long-term management is the same. Make sure that you have your survey instrument, make sure that you do certain things to it, and think about your documentation and so forth. So survey data, model building, so this would deal with simulations, anything like that. Instrument data, observational data. So we can construct advice to researchers based on the kinds of things they do. They may not even really think about the fact that they probably have more in common for that kind of research. If they're using this kind of method, they have more in common with other researchers doing that method than they might with people in their own domain. And over there is where the archives and special collections and others comes in. It's research-related content. So there's the research websites, the administrative records. A lot of times, universities are wanting the libraries, archives to get involved with helping them with compliance. That's a slippery slope. It wants to be a partnership. We want to be able to help, but it's not, the university can't turn over to the library, oh, you take care of compliance. It has to be, how can we help them do that? So research reports, things that we're used to looking at. This is the picture that we have for research data. What we too often do is pluck information out of the middle column and just kind of, here's our data. That takes it out of its research project context. We also, when we think about things like faculty archives includes their lifetime of research activities. So the context of the humans, the projects, how do we retain that? Because that's going to be the value of the record keeping for science. The records of science, what do they look like? How do we maintain that as a chain of custody looking forward? So let's see, we have digital content report sections, collections development, thinking about rights, getting it in when you first encounter the content, not at the end. When we take it in, how do we process it? Preservation planning, what we've been talking about tonight, things to do about archival storage. Videos are gigantic. How are we going to, how do we make sure that we're ready for a whole bunch of video coming in? What are the roles along the way, and what are the issues about dissemination? For archives, it's perfectly reasonable to take in content that you know you'll never make available to anybody, maybe. It may never be requested, but it's still important. It's a record that might support a citizen's rights or something like that. From the library's perspective, we're increasingly moving towards a usage-based, like I digitize this based on use. That's a very different perspective, so we have to rationalize how those things come together. All right, we're going to stop there. That's the scope of digital preservation, how you do a sustainable digital preservation program. It's the factors to keep in mind. And it sounds like, when you're not acclimated to it, it sounds like, oh my God, that's a lot to do. The fact that we've had decades of practice, we have programs that we can look at, we have leaders in the field at Cornell, MIT has a long track record for doing things like this. We should never start feeling right now that we don't, there's always an example to look at. There's always there's a tool I can adapt. What shouldn't happen is that people feel like, I'm going to start inventing that wheel right now. They're, oh, nothing's happened. That research data in particular, we're inclined to think, well, surely nothing that's happened before has anything to do with me. It doesn't matter whether it's big data or little data. There's a lot of commonality in the things that we have to do. And the better our, the value of the technology leg is constructing really good tools for the humans to apply so that we can manage at scale, that we can ramp up, we can be responsive. What we don't want to do is only be able to do one kind of data and then end up having 5 more to deal with. You don't want to put yourself into a corner for not being flexible. You want to be extensible. You want to be responsive, and you want to be collaborative. Because my organization has strengths that I want to share with my peers. Not everybody has to do everything, and if we partner, we can come up with programs that are viable. And we know that we can do it because there's data in digital form that we've been preserving since the 60s. So that's digital preservation, that's digital curation. Okay, that's it. Okay. Are any of you working with preservation issues in your jobs at the now?
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen the note over there.
Yeah, I sort of feel like I'm the one pushing for policies. I'm one of 3 librarians, archivists, technically, at the company, and everybody else is coming from a very different perspective. So, so I've been teaming up with the 2 other LIS people, and we're really trying to implement, first write best practices guidelines because we're dealing with digital marketing assets.
Yeah.
So a different from research data, but still some of the same concepts apply.
Yeah.
So we have all of the storage needs are there, all of the building out of taxonomies and applying metadata in general, all of that stuff is there for storage. But I don't know where the preservation of those things, where the long-term management of those things comes into play. It's a startup, and it's cloud-based, so there's a lot of questions that we all have, I know, but I definitely extra do. So if I get fired full time, and not fired, I didn't say fired, full time, which
that's an important distinction.
I've actually been talking with them this week about, which has been very interesting. I would love to head that up in some capacity, but we'll see.
That would be great.
Yeah.
Do you have confidential information, or is it all public?
Some of the assets are confidential. We have a whole usage policy though. Some are archived and we have different user profiles and permissions. So people, because it's for internal company stuff. So we have specific clients, and it's the people in the company are using the dam. So certain departments will be blocked from seeing certain assets and everything. But nothing is terribly confidential. But I think there's also a lot of appraisal or just an understanding of a retention schedule that needs to get implemented as well, because people just keep scaling up, and the companies just want to continue to add and add and add, and there needs to be this consultation that maybe that's not best.
Some of the coming out of the computer science community, we often hear storage is cheap, but it does become less and less expensive over time, but management doesn't.
Right.
And it's that whole layer, all these actions that people have to do really changes the cost factors for doing it. So you could maybe say, oh, well, I would keep everything, but from an archival perspective, it's you want to be selective. You want to make sure that what you keep is that you have criteria for this is significant to us and this isn't. And so how do you go about doing that? It's something that we just know from the research data perspective. We don't have that. We don't have a lot of good examples of taking a scheduling approach to research data. But the other thing you were talking about cloud services, which is why I was asking about confidential. There are services like Archival and a few others that are cloud-based and can be hosted, but they are constructed so that you can manage confidential information. Yeah.
Locks and Portico and all that fit into this?
So, certainly from the journal's perspective, now Locks, lots of copies keep stuff safe. They've been partnered. Their version of partnering with the big publishers is Clocks, and Portico is similarly doing that. Initially, they were only focused on journals, and now they're expanding out and going into special collections. The library community has finally discovered special collections. Archivists are sort of like, welcome to the party. And I'm hoping that we see partnerships in that. So locks can be used, like you can implement a private locks network, and it's a really effective way for either a single organization or partners of organizations to meet the criteria, the standards for multiple copies in multiple places. So most places, like MIT, we are now a member of Portico and Clocks. That's really common. What we know is it's really hard to determine if the full set of journals is actually preserved because of the different ways they're represented. There's something called the Keepers Registry that is trying to look at what's been digitized, and there's other things that kind of measure, if you have a whole run of a journal and you're missing one, so how do we really monitor, how do we really know, and how do we invest? Locks is a great thing because if you're a member of the Locks Alliance, they help you to reach out to smaller publishers and to smaller, academic presses, and to capture information right from their website. So it gives, if you subscribe to Clocks and Portico, it's great, and you're contributing to the long-term management of all of the published work that from those publishers that are covered. Locks Alliance allows you to build beyond that, to protect things that, so for MIT, there's a lot of small technical kind of reports or places or things like that. Locks can really help with that. So we're looking at implementing it.
So we've been looking at the preservation of our institutional repository content, right?
Right.
And looking at Locks, Portico, and the press itself.
Yeah.
And I wondered if MIT has a solution for preserving its, what do you use?
DSpace.
DSpace, yeah, DSpace.
So what we have two instances of DSpace. One is DSpace at MIT, which is our institutional repository, and it has our theses and that piece of it in there. A lot of it has to be brought in by the libraries itself. Like we have people who are actively going out and pulling things into it. And then we also have DOME, because MIT's logo is a dome, but it's for special collections and for things mostly for things that we digitize. As soon as I got there, I was like, well, as long as we know that DSpace isn't on its own doing preservation unless we make it do preservation. No, and we have full agreement that, from the people who are involved with digital content management of, right, DSpace is not doing that. So what we've been doing with the pieces that I was talking about with the workflows and things is building a foundation layer underneath. We're putting in place the infrastructure so that DSpace doesn't have to do that. We don't have to have the preservation copies in there. And whether people bring, like the producers might be used to depositing or used to that as a space, they don't really, we're a black box inside. So we can say, oh great, give us your stuff and we'll make it available. Then we take it through a preservation cycle to do all the actions that we have to preserve it. Our new director is from Stanford, so very, very interested in locks, very interested in Hydra and some other kinds of approaches to that. So I think we're going to be moving in that direction. DSpace itself is going through some change. There's the current roadmap. There's new partners involved. And the developing world is very, very interested. They're kind of where we were with DSpace about a decade ago. They're very interested in it. There maybe be the bigger user base coming up. So there's some question marks around what's the future for this, for DSpace. But from my perspective, you don't want to make every system into a preservation system. You want to build a strong foundation, and then you can have DSpace and anything that you want. Content DM. I get asked a lot, can Content DM be a preservation system? Yes, but only if you make it. And do you really want to tool out all of your systems to do preservation, or do you want to make it partner so that you have a preservation system in place that can interact with all of the systems and be much more flexible? It's a kind of economies of scale.
What?
Economies of scale.
Thank you.
Yeah. And including partnerships. So the downturn in 2008 was a really hard time for everybody. But one of the things that's happened is a lot of major institutions are actually partnering when they never would have before. Columbia and Cornell. We've been actually having very productive conversations with Harvard. It also, when you're dealing with good practice, if you, by default, you have to have multiple copies in multiple places, then you really want to have partners who can help you kind of achieve that, and service providers and everything. There's a lot of collaboration between the open source providers like Archivematica, who they're compliant preservation workflows that were built for archival content. One of the things is a lot of what we had was built for library materials, but it wasn't really suited to the archival piece. We have archive space, and it's funny because at work now people are like, another archive thing. Yes, Archivematica, archive space, Archivum, and we're looking at how to put the pieces together. We don't have good ways of delivering the full range of MIT created content yet, but that's a big focus, and I think it's going to change pretty rapidly in the next year, 3 years. Yeah. I've so enjoyed being here tonight. And thank you for having me, as always. And if you think of questions afterwards, I'm always happy to have follow-ups, and please do. And I'm good luck with finishing your program and graduating and all that good stuff that happens. And see you around the block.